This is what should not have appeared. A file, number, score? A single digit that decides whether a human being walks free or waits in a cell. But the algorithm that produces that number was not trained on crime. It was trained on the decisions of judges. And that difference changes everything. You just saw the first crack. Every time a system claims to predict future danger, someone already knew what would appear in the output. What appears is not risk. What appears is a mirror held up to the institution that built it. The official story goes like this. In 1998, a company called Northpoint released the Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions. You know it as COMPAS. The system evaluated 137 variables: age, employment, housing stability, criminal history. It was marketed to courts as an objective measure of who would reoffend, a tool that replaced the fallible human with the cold precision of data. That version became the industry standard. By 2013, the Laura and John Arnold Foundation had launched the Public Safety Assessment, a 9-question tool that stripped out even the type of crime from its inputs. The promise was the same: remove bias, standardize decisions, make the system fairer. But the evidence says otherwise. Let's look at the anchor points. In 2017, a study in Science Advances tested COMPAS against a simple linear regression model, a line drawn through 2 variables, age and prior arrests. The linear model predicted recidivism correctly 66% of the time. COMPAS scored 65%. There was no statistical difference. The expensive proprietary algorithm was no better than a pencil and a ruler. The evidence of this comparison should be preserved. Subscribe to follow the trail of data and uncover how these systems are built. Every new case adds another layer to the dossier. Leave a comment with the word mirror and tell us, did you already sense that the algorithm was only reflecting, not predicting? Here is where the case changes. That finding points at something deeper than accuracy. It points at the data itself. When researchers Richard Burke and his team analyzed 30,784 cases in 2018, they discovered something the official story had omitted. Models trained on judges' release decisions produced false positive rates 12 percentage points higher for Black defendants than models trained on raw crime data. The disparity persisted after controlling for prior offenses. Think about what that means. The algorithm is not predicting crime. It is predicting what a judge would decide. And if the judge's decisions contain bias, the algorithm learns that bias as truth. The file contains more. In May 2016, ProPublica published Machine Bias, an investigation that revealed COMPAS was significantly more likely to label Black defendants as high risk despite identical recidivism rates. The study sparked congressional hearings. Northpoint defended the tool, but the damage to the official story was irreversible. Now, we peeled the first layer. A white paper published by the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers in 2023 documented that all major U.S. pretrial risk tools, COMPAS, the Public Safety Assessment, the Level of Service Inventory Revised, derive their training sets from judicial discretion data, not from the underlying criminal acts, from the decisions of the very system they were supposed to correct. The evidence, when you follow it closely, reveals something unsettling. The Department of Justice's Pretrial Services Guidelines, updated in December 2020, formally endorsed the use of tools trained on historical decision data. The language is explicit: trained on decision data, not on the crimes themselves. The institution that reviews the tools certified the flaw. Now peel the second layer. In July 2022, Equivant, the company that acquired Northpoint, announced that COMPAS had been retrained using a judicial decision dataset. Prior judges' release and detain recommendations became the new ground truth. The algorithm was now literally modeling the behavior of the people it was meant to correct. That sentence changes everything. Subscribe to stay inside the investigation. This file deepens with every piece of evidence we examine together. Drop the word feedback in the comments and share where you've encountered a system that started to reproduce its own shadows. So, what was the algorithm trained on? On the aggregate behavior of judges? On decisions made in courtrooms where the race of the defendant, the zip code of the home address, the quality of legal representation, the mood of the presiding magistrate? All of that was baked into the training labels. The algorithm learned to reproduce a system that had already been proven to produce racial disparities. This is the hidden truth. The algorithm never evaluated risk. It evaluated the probability that a judge would detain a person. It was a prediction of institutional behavior. not of future crime. Now look at what happens when the system collapses in on itself. The algorithm trains on judicial decisions. The judge uses the algorithm to decide. The algorithm then trains on the new decisions, a feedback loop that progressively amplifies the original bias until the datasheet and the real world become indistinguishable. Here is where the case stops looking accidental. The 2018 study by John Kleinberg and his team showed that any risk score calibrated on judicial outcomes inevitably inherits the judge's own bias. They calculated a minimum 5% disparity in error rates across racial groups. The bias is not a bug in the code. It is a structural requirement of the training method. Now, the confrontation. If you have ever been assessed by a system and felt that the result did not correspond to the facts of your case, you know what it means to be processed by an architecture that was built to reproduce a pre-existing pattern. The algorithm does not see you. It sees the average behavior of the judges in the district where you were arrested. The file contains a number you should remember. The level of service inventory, the first actuarial tool, was created in 1979 by James Bonta and Donald Andrews at the University of Toronto. It introduced structured data-driven assessment as an alternative to clinical judgment. But the clinical judgment it replaced was simply replaced by a mirror. The public safety assessment, launched in 2013, deliberately omits any direct crime type variable. It asks 9 questions: age, prior misdemeanor count, pending charge status. But the training data for the model comes from judicial outcomes. The tool predicts what judges do, not what defendants will do. Now, the personal implication. Every time a risk score decides your fate, you are not being measured. You are being compared to the institutional history of the people who sat in judgment before you arrived. The score is a derivative of past decisions, and past decisions contain the biases of every era from which they were drawn. Pause. That silence is evidence too. The gap between what the tools claim and what they do has been documented by at least 4 major peer-reviewed studies, a congressional investigation, a Department of Justice guideline, and the industry's own press releases. And yet, the tools remain in use in courts across the United States. The reason is not hard to find. The tools provide legal cover. When a judge cites a COMPAS score in a detention order, the decision appears objective. The appeal focuses on the score, not on the judge's reasoning. The algorithm absorbs the responsibility. The institution remains intact. But the record says something else. The Department of Justice guideline from 2020 warns that tools trained on historical decision data may perpetuate existing disparities. The warning is buried on page 42 of a 78-page document. It is not read aloud in court. Now, the original question. The algorithm that decides who goes to jail was never trained on crime. It was trained on the recorded decisions of judges. That is not a marginal difference. That is a complete reversal of the premise. The system was marketed as a solution to judicial bias. It turned out to be a database of judicial bias with a score attached. The second layer of evidence confirms this. Equivant's own press release from 2022 states explicitly that the new training dataset used judicial recommendations. They called it an improvement. But an algorithm trained to reproduce judicial decisions cannot correct judicial errors. It can only replicate them at scale. Now, the final confronting question. If the algorithm was trained on judges, what happens when the judges themselves are being evaluated by the algorithm? The feedback loop closes. The system becomes self-referential. The score predicts the decision. The decision validates the score. The bias compounds with each iteration. You are now inside the file. The architecture of the system is not neutral. It was designed to produce outputs that match the historical distribution of decisions. And the historical distribution of decisions in the U.S. criminal justice system has been measured and documented to produce racial disparities at every stage from arrest to sentencing. The algorithm did not introduce bias. It institutionalized it. It made the bias invisible by wrapping it in a number. That is the architecture we have been tracing. Subscribe to follow the case file as it collapses into its own logic. The next layer will reveal what has been withheld. In the comments, write "invisible" and tell us, when did you first realize the number was never neutral? This is just the surface. What comes next closes it in a way you will not expect. The third layer of evidence has not been released. Equivant has not published the full training dataset from the 2022 retraining. The National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers requested it under discovery. The request was denied. The file is still open. The score is still being calculated. And the question that remains unanswered is not what the algorithm was trained on. The question is who authorized the training in the first place, and why the institutional response has been to hide the data instead of auditing the model. You already know what that silence means. Every file has a signature. The signature of this one is not a name or a date. It is a gap. The gap between what the system promises and what it delivers. Between the objective number and the subjective history it encodes. Between the claim of reform and the architecture of replication. The evidence says otherwise. The algorithm was trained on judges. The judges were trained in a system. The system was built by institutions. And those institutions have a documented history of producing outcomes that fall unevenly across race, class, and zip code. The algorithm did not discover that pattern. It encoded it. Now, the record closes with a timestamp. In 2023, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers published its white paper. The conclusion was stark. Every major pretrial risk tool in the United States derives its training labels from judicial discretion, not from crime. From discretion. From the variable, inconsistent, biased history of human judgment. The institutions that built the tools knew. The Department of Justice guideline buried the warning on page 42. Equivant retrained on judicial data and called it progress. ProPublica documented the disparity. The studies confirmed the mechanism. The response was not to audit the model. The response was to hide the data. This is the architecture you have been tracing. The algorithm was never a solution. It was a translation of institutional history into a score that looks objective, a score that feels scientific, a score that is actually a fossil of every decision made before the defendant walked into the courtroom. The file closes with the original claim. The court receives a number. The number claims to predict risk. But the number was trained on the recorded behavior of the people who sit at the bench. The algorithm does not predict crime. It predicts compliance with the institution that defined the crime. That is not a failure of the model. That is the model.